this project. So yeah, my name is Catherine Scudder. I am the lead PI from Educopia Institute on this fabulous project called OSSArcFlow that I know many of you have been keeping up with now for 3 years. We're hitting the 3-year mark right now and just finished this project. It's been generously funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Our co-PIs on this project and deep partners throughout are UNC's School of Information and Library Science. Cal Lee, who all of you know, I'm sure, has been co-PI on this project with me. And then we'll go through the team later, so I'm not gonna go through all of that right now. But today we get to have the sincere pleasure of sharing with you some of the outputs of this project and really fulfill some of the goal that we had with this project to begin with, which was to make sure that the outputs that we're producing around workflow creation and making workflows easier both to see and to compare for different institutions, making that something that everybody can do without having to hire us to do it, without having to consult with us to do it, using all of the tools that we've built during this project. So this was a research project under IMLS, and the 2 core research questions that drove us were, first and foremost, how can institutions combine tools to support workflows that actually meet local institutional needs? So one of the things that we were seeing back when we first started proposing this project, and I'll share that we proposed this project for 3 years before it was funded. And it really was a matter of, I think, and I don't mean this to sound like we think that we were way ahead of the field, but I think it took, you know, peer review catching up with us in the sense that there was a dominant view that we should be able to have one end-to-end solution, and that tools should be able to be interoperable in this kind of national context within end-to-end solutions where workflows would just work for everybody. And so there was a kind of in-the-box notion. And one of the things that this project was pushing back on was that notion. And we were asking, well, we haven't seen end-to-end solutions be very reasonable or adopted thus far. And why is that? What are the things that are happening, and how can institutions usefully combine tools to support whatever is happening locally? Because we recognize that there are a lot of local issues that are arising, especially drivers that are human, not even technical. And then the second big research question was very deeply connected to the first, which is how can institutions implement the handoffs between systems that are performing different functions on the same data? So next slide. So there were 3 OSS systems, open source software systems that we worked with in this project. The intent was to take 3 core parts of the life cycle of born digital content management and really investigate how those might bridge. And so we rested with Curator for the forensic disk imaging and kind of early stage bringing in of concrete, hard, you know, physical objects, physical disks, and getting the information off of those disks and into spinning disks. Archive space as the repository space and collection management tool. And then Archivematica for the kind of microservices and curation components. And we chose these 3 because all of them were in broad use. They all had good community-based apparatuses around them. And we had 12 institutions that all committed to putting into play at least 2 of these in their local environment over the course of this project. Next slide, please. So those partner institutions were chosen to represent a broad swath of the types of libraries and archives and even museums that we see wrestling with born digital content. So the academic libraries that were part of this project include MIT, and Kari Smith is here talking with us today. Mount Holyoke, so we had a smaller liberal arts college, Stanford University Libraries, Rice, Emory, Atlanta University Center, which gave us a consortium, Duke University Libraries, and then New York University. Public libraries, we included 2 large ones. So we recognize that those are large ones, but still got public library representation and some of the issues that are specific to public libraries there, with New York Public Library and DC Public Library. And then we also worked with one research institute, the Odom Institute at UNC, and one historical society, Kansas Historical Society. Next slide. And, you know, one of the things that we wrestled with in this project, it started off as a 2-year project, and it was a super ambitious project. And as often happens in large projects, we had a lot of staff turnover that hit the project at key moments. And so we wound up asking for a no cost extension for a 3rd year. And so the overall swath of activities stretched from year 1 to year 3 and literally just wrapped up on June 30th. So we started with data gathering, and we did a lot of work with our 12 partners to understand what their current digital curation workflows looked like. We analyzed those, we created representations of those. We worked with them to think about how those might improve and what they would like to see that is different. We developed and tested some tools and aspirational workflows with them, and then we are now at the iterate and disseminate moment in the project, especially for the methodology that we used for all of those components. Next slide. So this is the team. So again, Cal and I were the lead principal investigators on this project. Sam Meister also served as a principal investigator for a year of the project. Technical team included folks from UNC Chapel Hill and the Big Curator Consortium, as well as Archivematica and Lyrasis. And then we had a lot of staff and an evaluator who worked closely with us for, you know, all of the tasks of this grant. And then I've listed partners that have been, you know, genuinely partners on this project. They were there for every step of the process, and without them, we certainly would not have the tools and the workflows that we'll be sharing with you today. Next slide. So today's presenters are Alex Chasanoff, who was the first project manager, or no, second project manager, sorry, on this project. Jessica Meyerson was the first one. Jessica Farrell, who has helped with all of the wrap-up activities of this grant. Colin Post, who was a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill at the beginning of this project, and who is now a faculty member at UNCG. Kari Smith from MIT, and then Hannah Wong, who has been a miracle last project manager for this project, really helping us to pull together the learning modules and the guide. And now I'll hand it over to them and let them talk you through it.
Hi, everybody. Can you see my screen and hear me okay?
We can.
Great. So just as Catherine said, I was the second and middle project manager on the OSSArcFlow project, and Colin and I worked together during this time and decided that it would be helpful as part of one of the sort of project outputs, and this is sort of in alliance with the goals of the project, to present some of what we've been doing some analysis on a lot of the data that we've collected. And one of the things that has been sort of most obvious in the field is that there is a lack of documentation about how everybody's developing their workflows. And so that was sort of part of the impetus for putting together the guide, which is part of a larger aim of the project to provide documentation for institutions of all sizes. And so what we're hoping with this guide that's now freely available and downloadable from the Educopia website is to provide kind of assistance to institutions to talk through what are the typical steps that you'll be taking as you go through the process of documenting your Born Digital workflow. And so for this part of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about what went into thinking for the guide, what the purpose is, what the workflow steps are, and kind of how you might use the guide as you move through this process. So I was a project manager on the project, working at Educopia. Now I work at North Carolina Central as an assistant professor in the Library and Information School, and Colin has also just accepted a faculty position, as Catherine said, at UNCG Greensboro. So let's just get started. Advance ahead. So the purpose of the guide is to encourage and assist collecting institutions to begin documenting their workflows. So institutions of all different sizes. And the guide really is not meant to be prescriptive or linear necessarily. What it does do is takes 13 common workflow steps and provides more information about the tools needed to carry out and implement those steps. We also go on to describe how institutions can use the guide to document their workflows, and then we talk a little bit at the end about how these workflows can be used to advance your institutional goals. So what is Born Digital Archiving, just as a background? Increasingly records and knowledge is essentially created in digital form and being acquired by archives in digital formats. And so as we're moving into this space, archives and libraries and museums are being tasked with the responsibility of caring for these sorts of materials. And these are very different, they require different caretaking than print materials because they have a different life cycle. And so the OSSArcFlow project really focused on exploring what that process would look like throughout the life cycle of these materials, from acquisition through processing. And so here are the 13 common workflow steps that we identified. And the 13 steps outlined here, as I said, were identified through the workflow assessment and documentation process, which was done in collaboration with the 12 OSSArcFlow partners that Catherine listed previously. And these steps were the most common processes undertaken by partners when archiving born digital content. And it's not to say that each of these steps was essentially undertaken by each institution, and it's not to say necessarily that each of these institutions perform these steps in this order or a particular order. That's one of the sort of central findings of the project, is that it's really difficult to prescribe a particular set of steps and linear workflow when institutions are not only using different software and systems and have different needs, but are also implementing systems and software in different ways. And so if we look specifically at one of our examples, this is an example from NYU of a section of their workflow that we documented as part of the project. This is a good example of how steps are often assembled in different ways for different collections and even units within an institution. So in this workflow, forensic disk images at NYU at the time that this was created are not created for all materials, but heterogeneous born digital materials get this forensic disk treatment. So staff create a logical copy of the files when they're donor appraised, curated digital files, or large structured transfers from partners. So we use this example just to show that even within the same institution, not all materials will even move through the workflow in the same way. And so in addition to simply outlining steps in the guide, we wanted to provide context for how and why institutions might carry out each step. So for example, so looking at one of the steps, step number 2 in our list, transferring materials to an institution, the way we describe the step in the guide is really in terms of focusing on the action and the details that happen during that step. And we use partner examples to flesh out particulars for the particular step. And so you'll see here that this is, we feature a case study here, a brief little snippet from Emory University that talks about how this particular step took place at their institution. And then the second thing that we do in the guide is we provide this context around implementation, and we provide a list of tools that can be used, primarily focusing on open source software tools and resources. So these are all, URLs that potentially, they're active as of a month ago, but these are, resources that should be available and able for you to use as you go through this step of, for example, transferring materials to an institution. And the other thing to mention is that the implementation recommendations are really designed around sort of problem areas, like where based on our partners' experiences and sort of just general consultations with folks using these different kinds of software environments, where are the pain points, and what are some tips that we can provide that would help assist you. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Colin.
Great, thanks, Alex. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to be talking about what the process of actually creating this workflow documentation looks like. And this is just going to be a quick overview of the process, and more details are laid out in the guide, as well as in the learning modules that we created. So why might you want to document your workflows? So as Catherine and Alex have been talking about, these born digital archiving workflows include lots of different steps, lots of different tools, involve many different staff members, often working across different departments or units within the institution. And with the nature of born digital archiving, these workflows can change quickly as new staff are brought on or as new tools are brought into the process. So creating this documentation kind of helps to make sense of a big picture overview of what born digital archiving looks like at your institution, and also provides sort of tangible artifacts that you can use to coordinate activities and conversations and discussions around these archiving practices across different departments and between different staff members. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the documentation process, as we outline it, really includes sort of three main steps. So first, assessing your current practices using a self-guided questionnaire that we've developed, creating textual descriptions of the workflow steps, and then creating a visual diagram based on those textual descriptions. And across this entire process, we found that it's really important to attack this documentation exercise with a team that represents all the different people that are involved in born digital archiving at your institution. So bringing in people that are involved in different steps of the process to contribute their perspectives. So you get this sort of holistic, big picture overview, and not just sort of what one department does, but what the entire institution does. Next slide. So the first step is assessing your workflows. And so we've developed a self-guided questionnaire that we used with the partners in the OSSArcFlow project, and now we've sort of adapted it so that it can be done as a self-guided assessment. And so the questionnaire kind of asks you to think through your born digital archiving practices at your institution at both a sort of granular level of individual steps and activities, but also with some prompts to take a big picture overview of what some of the goals of your workflows are, what some of the bigger challenges that you're facing are. And an important point for the assessment step is to really be as detailed as possible, sort of throw all of the information about your current practices in there. And at the kind of initial assessment stage, don't really worry about being messy or including too much stuff, because the next sort of steps are designed to streamline all of that sort of messy, complex information about what you're doing into more useful documentation. Next slide. So once you've sort of gotten through all of the assessment and sort of talked about all of the different things that you do as part of your Born Digital Archiving, the next step is to really hammer that into a linear description of discrete steps. So sort of this happens first, this is who's involved in it, these are the tools that are used, and then once that step is completed, it moves on to this next step. And we developed sort of two approaches to use in tandem to describe the workflows. So one is sort of creating a outline as a Word document that sort of has each step following the other, providing information about the individuals and the tools that are involved in each step. And then complementing that is a spreadsheet that arranges that same information in this sort of tabular format. And we found that doing both the sort of outline and the spreadsheet work really well together because they each sort of summarize the workflow steps in useful ways that complement each other. Next slide, please. So when you're putting these into the outline and the spreadsheet, there's just a couple useful pointers. So it's important at this stage to really sort of clearly define the workflow steps and again, provide details about staff roles and tools, and then also detail any conditions or special cases. So like Alex talked about with the NYU example, you know, if something only happens under certain conditions, like you only create forensic disk images for certain kinds of materials, make sure you note that in these descriptive documents as well. Next slide. So the next step is to create a visual diagram of the workflows. So basically it's taking all that information about the steps and the tools and rendering it in this visual diagram form. We, OSSArcFlow, used Lucidchart to do this, and I'll talk about a little bit of what we did in using Lucidchart. So next slide, please. So some of the big decisions that you'll want to make, whether you're using Lucidchart or whether you are using another process modeling tool, is deciding what sort of shapes and symbols you want to use. And in the guide, there is a link to the Lucidchart template that we used in the project. So you should be able to access that template whether or not you have a Lucidchart account. But then I think if you want to, you know, create your own workflows using that template, you would need to create an account to further use the tools in Lucidchart. But you should at least be able to see the template with or without an account. And so I've just kind of highlighted here some of the symbols that we use to indicate different parts of the workflow diagrams. And as you'll see, there's sort of different shapes and different symbols that you can put in to mark different things about the workflows. Next slide. So a couple tips about the visual diagramming part. So here you really want to keep the diagrams easy to read, understand, and use. So sort of at the top level of the diagram, you're really just including concise descriptions of the steps, one to the next one, although you can include some of the additional details about the tools or the staff that are involved or different challenges that are coming up at different points in the process in annotations as well. Next slide. I'm not sure if I got another one or not. Yeah, so just sort of pointing out some of the different ways that you can include some of that additional detail through annotations or through sort of running bars that mark like what tools are being used or what staff are involved. But sort of in the middle of the diagram is really just concise definitions of each step and how they relate to one another. That might be it. Maybe I've got one more. Yep, that's all for me.
Okay, thanks, Colin. So for this last section, I'll describe the final section of the guide, which aims to provide guidance and examples of how, as an institution, you can use your workflow once you've created it to identify growth and maturity goals, to advocate for resources, and to transform the roles and relationships that can help an institution improve and advance practices. And so as Colin discussed, the process of documenting workflows results in an artifact that in turn allows institutions to actively self-reflect in a number of intersecting ways. So first, institutions can compare and analyze their own workflows. You can, by sharing your workflows with other institutions, you can see what tools they're using, what tools you're using. You can look at similarly sized institutions to see what's similar and what's different. And this is really helpful for sort of a quick perspective on this sort of in an emerging field of practice where institutions of different sizes and resources are working in different ways. Which tools are the ones that are the common ones that are being used, and particularly open source software tools that are helping institutions move through the workflow at these different steps. This can be helpful for sharing tips and strategies. It can also lower implementation barriers. So in the OSSArcFlow project, 8 of the 9 institutions that create disk images overall used a particular tool. They used the Geimager tool within the Big Curator environment. And so knowing the particular environment in which tool use took place provided important context for any sort of automation efforts that might rely on, for example, metadata exchange, knowing that most of these institutions were using the Geimager tool within the Big Curator environment provides a certain amount of necessary context that can make next steps towards automation more achievable. Workflows can also help institutions identify gaps and challenges. So, a wide range of gaps and challenges, or what we call them pain points in the OSSArcFlow project, impact all stages of born digital workflows. And visualizing this can really demonstrate the difficulties to surface sort of missing points of communication between staff across departments. For example, workflow modeling really helps to reveal some of these inhibiting factors that can prevent institutions from moving forward. And the act of generating documentation can often force an institution to confront these issues in ways that, the issues may not have been readily apparent, but when you visualize them, they become a lot clearer. And so, as in the previous example, popularly used digital curation tools are often run within a variety of operating systems and environments. And so visualizing this easily illustrates how these are, part of a workflows. Workflows are a complex tool chain, are often comprised of a complex tool chain. So having those adequate kind of pipelines between system inputs and outputs to move the workflow forward is essential for implementation. And comparison and analysis of workflows can help institutions to identify and assess current gaps in an emerging practices area, while also helping to prompt articulation of future goals for institutions that are still actively building out their processing. So one of the things we talk about in the guide and in the OSSArcFlow project overall is that you may start from this place that may seem, ad hoc, or we only have 3 processes in our workflow currently. But even just starting from that beginning process of documenting allows you to envision where you might go next. And so these, creating workflow artifacts presents institutions with this universe of possible activities and roles and responsibilities and decisions. So you can sort of see what born digital processing actually looks like in action. And visualizing these activities provides the difference for institutions to solve prior implementation barriers by identifying them as a first step. And this is just an example, zooming in of a pain point and how we actually documented it. And so, you know, for example, identifying this pain point that happens before you scan materials is a particular issue that would solve that. In order for this workflow to advance, it would need to be solved, right? So managing the Bit Curator environment for quarantine work is challenging. And there are a particular set of questions that are illustrated here. And so by documenting these, you know, you're also just putting a placeholder for something that is a known pain point that can then be addressed or, you know, identified as a potential marker for advancing towards aspirational goals. And so a common shared pain point in our project was that the description and arrangement practices for analog collections don't always map very well onto born digital materials. And so at the time, there were absent best practices. Two of our partners from Duke and MIT used a breakout discussion session in the project to talk together about how they were using archive space to describe their born digital collections. The resulting discussion surfaced a lot of the pressing questions archivists will need to address as the profession develops these best practices. And, you know, my point is that documenting this and working together with other institutions help to illustrate how participants can envision archive space supporting emergent description and practices, and also how these practices might fit into their own workflows. And, you know, in our case, we of course had archive space as a partner, and so we were able to explore the possibilities of, you know, what would it look like for archive space to enhance their, you know, how would archive space have to modify their system in order to accommodate these sorts of instances. And so there's obviously a ton of future research that needs to go into this, but the first, you know, the kind of takeaway from the OSSArcFlow project is that first we have to learn more about how institutions are actually managing these objects and managing, you know, their own born digital processes and get familiar with that as a sort of first step. So that concludes our introduction to the guide, which again, you can download at the Educopia project page for OSSArcFlow. And we hope that the guide can offer a helpful overview of common steps for institutions that are processing born digital materials or beginning to think about this. And I'm now going to turn this over to Hannah. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Okay, so I'm Hannah Wong, and I was brought in at the end of the OSSArcFlow project in June to help project manage the deliverables and create learning modules. Normally, I'm the project manager for the Curator EDU project at Educopia, which is focused on studying professional development or professional education efforts around digital forensics. So I'll just quickly talk about the learning modules that we created at the end of the project. So each of the learning modules, which you can find through the Educopia website, corresponds to a different section of the guide. So it was mostly a matter of taking all the great material produced by Alex and Colin and transforming it into videos. The videos themselves can either be used as quick introductions to the written guide or as a way to access much of the same information for different learning styles. So the first video takes a look at how the project identified the 13 functions utilized by our partners, what those functions are, and how they might occur at different points in the workflow or not at all, depending really on the needs of the individual institution. So whereas the second two learning modules look really at workflow documentation and how it can be used, This first video is really just an outline and introduction to the steps that are likely to appear in one of these workflow diagrams. The second video, which was recorded by Colin, looks at the different steps that go into documenting an as-is workflow. I think that especially if you haven't had any formal training in analyzing business systems or documenting workflows, this video is a really helpful introduction in taking you from the initial assessment of current practices to describing those practices in a narrative way to creating a visual workflow diagram. The last video, using workflows, I really see as kind of the why of OSSArcFlow. There are a lot of ways that institutions can use their workflows as internal documentation, but as we saw with the project, some of the most exciting uses of this workflow documentation involves the collaboration and discussions that were sparked between institutions. So for this video, I talked to Josh Hogan and Christine Wiseman at the Atlanta University Center, Rebecca Russell at Rice University, and Farrell at Duke University, and they were all generous enough to lend their voices and perspectives to this final video. So the 3 learning modules are on YouTube and linked from the Educopia website, and transcripts for each video are also available in both locations. So I will stop sharing my screen now and turn it over to Josh.
Yeah, now we're going to just go into some discussion. So thanks everyone for hanging around. I know that you just took in a lot of information about the project, but I hope it has you thinking about some things. So if you have questions for Alex, Colin, Hannah, or Kari Smith, or Catherine, please go ahead and put those into the Q&A, or you can throw them into the chat and we'll see them there. I'm going to go ahead and start off and ask Kari some questions because I know that you all are really excited about hearing from one of the partners for this project. So Kari, I just would like to ask first, how have you used your Born Digital workflow documentation? And I guess I can put my...
Thank you. So I am Kari Smith, and I'm currently the Institute Archivist at MIT Libraries. When this project started, I was the digital archivist and headed the digital archives program at MIT. Ways that we have used the project outcomes, I would say, in a broad sense, and then specifically the workflows themselves, have been sort of myriad, I would say. So we've been able to use the specific outcomes of the as-is workflows and the to-be workflows that we documented by the project partners to be able to give ourselves actually comparisons by which I have been able to use that with our management and IT staff and kind of resource givers to be able to really have that comparison that is much more equal because we can talk about these are the specific activities in the areas in which we use the various tools and have the processes. And that's something that we didn't really have before this project, which was this vocabulary. That was something that more places were using, so we really could make honest comparisons. So that was certainly one thing that was a really great outcome of this. We've also used some of the outcomes. So one of the great things about the project was not just that the partners were looking at what were we using for the tools and how are we using them and what steps were we doing with them, but also the fact that we did have technical assistance from Lyrasis, from Lainey, from Archive Space, with Evelyn from Artifactual and around Archivematica, and then also with the big Curator team to help with sort of developing some of those bridge things that were needed. So there were some scripts that were created, the tools themselves did some evolution based on feedback that we had. And so we were able to test some of those at MIT. Some of the things that we learned were that, in fact, what had been created didn't necessarily fill the gaps, and then that just leads us to, again, having more information around things that either we need to tweak because of the specific ways that we use it at MIT, or just sort of in a broad sense of, you know, pointing back into the community. These are, again, still types of tasks and work that on a community basis, we kind of need to all provide input to and be able to figure out how do we get this back into those open source software communities. And that's, I think, a really big thing, was that this was looking at least 2 of 3 open source software systems that all have their own community. And so the project really kind of helped to get people involved in those communities if they hadn't necessarily before, as well as documenting their use of those tools. So we've got comparisons of partners across. Having that common vocabulary, like I said, was a really good thing. And then personally, I also teach the digital preservation management workshops, and I'm involved as an advisor on the library publishing workflows project, which is sort of another project that Educopia is project managing, and that is sort of a phase 2 of looking at, again, how do you document these workflows, and looking at the process of the documentation and the ways that we can do that using various tools and various types of workflow settings. So I think that's another thing, is being able to sort of take this work, what I'm doing at MIT, but then also kind of beyond MIT as well, and be able to leverage what I learned during this project out into both the donor communities that I work with now, Institute Records, thinking again about what are the various tools we might bring in, and how does this process that we work through of documenting those workflows in a way that's comparable across other organizations and institutions, taking those lessons learned with me in my current work.
Yeah, that's great. We always get unexpected benefits from projects that we that we don't expect to help us in ways. Yeah.
Absolutely. And just to answer a question that was in the Q&A, which was sort of what kinds of materials are we working with at MIT? So we were really trying to limit this to the born digital materials. So although we do in fact have and preserve some digitized content, mainly from media that things that would be on media like AV materials that are already within our archives. But this was looking at, so the workflows we were working on were things whereby we were bringing in email accounts, let's say, from administrators. We had files that were on personal laptops. So again, part of the steps of how do you get the content off, and then how do you assess it, and then kind of how do you keep going forward from there. We had a lot of it was heterogeneous types of materials, so varieties of file formats, varieties of eras of those software systems. So we had content that was going back to the 80s, pulling things off floppy disks, 3 1/4 inch floppy disks, as well as 5 1/4, and kind of a variety of things. So it's in the context of university and faculty papers, so it included topics like research, reports, work, varieties of vocabularies, and so also trying to understand how to use these various tools, and then thinking about how would we then organize them within an archives. So part of the archive space, organizational management side of things was important too. All of them were assumed to be used in the future and needing evidential value and context. And so therefore also, that content provided us with an opportunity to need to know things like fixity and how do we track exactly what the steps were as we went through our workflows.
Great, thanks. And so we have a question here from Adrian in the chat, so I'll go ahead and bring that one up. And this is for anybody, anybody on the project should feel free to answer this, I think. What are some good ways to share documentation and ways that help other institutions find and use it?
I'll start with that one. When I first started my job at MIT, I put a blog up, and I've seen this obviously a lot of other organizations as well, that was kind of talking specifically more about like how do we do our work rather than what is our content for our users. Those are often things that we share out, in other ways. But the way about how do we actually do our own work so that other archivists and other people that do digital curation can learn from us is a really important thing. And so we had a blog, Engineering the Future of the Past, and on that blog then is where we would sort of post some of those things. Currently, the staff within the MIT, we're now the Department of Distinctive Collections, and again, the sort of workflows and processing steps that we're using are something that people are working towards being able to make publicly accessible. So I think in a way, it's sort of the posting about them, making them online, being able to share those things.
Yeah, and I will just say that the BCC is really interested in making these things more apparent and findable too. So we're actively working on that on our end as well. So keep a lookout on the BCC website over the next 6 months or so, and hopefully you'll see some more great resources like that popping up. And then we have a question from Renee. How can archives with little or no digital workflow use this guide and the modules? Should it be used more than once?
I can at least start an answer to that. So I think that the guidance and the learning modules should definitely be utilized by people who don't necessarily feel like they have, a great, completely fleshed out workflow in place. I think that certainly for some of the partners on the project, they didn't necessarily feel totally comfortable with their workflows going into it, but just the process of documenting it really illuminate some of the decisions that need to be made, highlight, where you might need to start using a certain tool or bring in, a curator or a different archivist to help with X function. So I think that it can be used early and often.
And I'll just chime in real quickly to say that we've seen with the project partners over the course of the project, several of the project partners have already gone back and kind of put themselves back through the paces again, either for different collections, and because as we described early in the presentation, as Alex described early in the presentation, every type of content in many institutions requires a slightly different workflow. And so going back through this process over and over again just helps to bring the right voices to the table. It helps to situate conversations between the different players that need to make decisions to streamline or to change things. And then documenting that along the way, one of the things that's really powerful is you've got a baseline once you've done it the first time. And then you can go back and you can see how things have changed and you can show others how things have changed. And so that transparency really is something that from the beginning of this project was an ambition that we weren't sure we were going to be able to realize. And I would say it's one of the most powerful things that this project has produced. And the partners and the staff at UNC Chapel Hill and at Educopia have just done remarkable jobs in making sure that transparency of process is part of what this is providing. So yeah, definitely multiple times.
And then the last question that I have here in the Q&A, which please feel free to keep adding things to the Q&A. We have some more time to answer more questions, is from Hannah. Are there workflows that mix open source systems with materials that originate in SharePoint? And I think it would be great if any of the folks can speak to this, but I kind of just wanted to start with, yes, I'm sure there's workflows out there that do that. I don't know, I don't think any of them were documented in this particular project, which was focusing on open source systems only, but I'd love to hear from the audience if people have any experience doing, working on a workflow like that at your own institution. And then of course, any of the panelists here who would like to speak to that as well.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that definitely every partner was using tools outside of the main three that we highlighted in the project. I mean, we had the main three because we were able to get representatives from those vendors to be part of the project, but that was, I think the breadth and diversity of the tools that were used, everything from, commercial systems to homegrown scripts or little like patches in between steps, like the whole gamut of different types of tools were used at pretty much every partner that was in the part of the project. So I think then that was what Catherine spoke to at the beginning, that there is no end-to-end tool that's going to do everything. So this kind of like heterogeneity of all the different kinds of tools that are used is a reality of digital curation. And that's one of the things that really documenting workflows can help to make sense of how do all these different pieces fit together, and are there points where there are clear gaps between, okay, this tool doesn't speak to this tool, what can we do about it? So the workflows really help to address that specific issue.
And to show how many institutions share that issue. So one of the things that we're certainly hopeful that as more and more institutions are chronicling their workflows, identifying those gaps is going to get easier, both for the service providers and the communities, as well as, you know, for individual institutions that are looking for partners for projects. Kari wants to talk.
Just in response to Hannah Silverman's question there, I think, Hannah, one of the ways that often when you look at these workflows, what you'll notice is that people would say, I was getting content from a network drive, or I was getting content from a media object. So rather than specifically calling out SharePoint or OneDrive as that place, it would be more of a, is this a network transfer? And if so, then what tools were we using? So I think, especially in the sort of the partner ones, we were trying to be a bit more, or people were often a bit more kind of open as to what that would be, and then therefore what were the requirements in doing that transfer. So in that example that was shown earlier on when we were discussing it, it was the, do you need to have a logical transfer? Do you need a disk image transfer? And what specifically were you trying to do to get the content into kind of the first phase of then the other types of the steps? So I think that, to the point of there are workflows that people are documenting that say, here's how you get content from SharePoint to something. But I would say that in this project, we were really kind of looking at a bit more open-sided of what were the types of things we were doing, and then what were we using to do those things.
And then Paul shared in the Q&A the Copter wiki, which is an awesome resource. Definitely, we love that one. And then I wanted to ask this question of you guys. Do you have any recommendations about how to organize a collaboration with archivists and sectors to develop workflows in a specific context? For example, I work as an archivist for foundations, so my workflows will be somewhat different from those for an institutional archive or a library. And it would be great to be able to build out workflows to share with other foundation or corporate archivists. And I think the SharePoint, when I was a corporate archivist, we used SharePoint. So, that kind of is where my mind was going with the SharePoint question as well. So that question was from Lori Eden.
I think, Lori, a great way of doing that is, what are the groups that you're currently involved in that have other foundation or corporate archivists, and then basically to try and get a group together and say, hey, let's work through, now that we have this guide, it's really great because there is a, here, let's watch these webinars and let's walk through the steps. In the back of the guide, there's here is the questions to ask yourself and to walk through them. Here's a mechanism. And the Lucid chart is free and is an open, it's an open tool that you can use and say, like, let's actually document our steps and then get together and have those conversations and figure out what you can do. So I think, we were able to do it, speaking as a partner on this project, as part of this grant project. So things like that were pulled together for us. And there was not a there before, but now using this guide, I really do think that, pulling together that, groups of a feather, I'm not quite sure how you say the birds of a feather kind of a group for specifically, corporate and foundation archivists would be fantastic. And then again, you might be able to be more specific about, we start from SharePoint or we start from the specific kind of a tool that foundations would use from, and then how do we export content and then kind of go from there. So what are the workflow steps specific to your domain, and how they differ or precede, in fact, some of the work that we're looking at for overall general more digital archive work flows.
Exactly. The thing that I'll tag onto there is that the tools that we have produced here, meaning the guide and the learning modules, are really meant to be scaffolding that you can take and run with, and that give you all of the elements that you need to provide that kind of facilitation structure for yourself without it having to be a huge heavy lift. And so we're going to be really excited to see, what comes out of that. And we'll love to hear back from folks. I know that just in the last month, I had a conversation with the Smithsonian, and these are the kinds of issues that are happening or that are coming up more and more, including within like institutions that are within institutions. So in something like the Smithsonian, where you have in essence a consortium of museums that are all together, but all have different processes, how do you start to use workflows to at least understand what each other are doing? And I think, you know, working within a particular sector and working across sectors can be really powerful, revealing tools about what your processes are and about ways that you can consolidate and streamline, and also ways that, you know, if there are a lot of archives that are running into the same problems, that maybe you can come together around a shared solution. And Copter, just I saw in the questions that someone was asking about Copter again. Copter is COPTR, and it is this absolutely fantastic tool that Paul Wheatley designed back in like 2000, either 11 or 14. And it's been out there as a global registry in essence for a lot of different things. But one of the things that it has a space for is community-owned workflows.
Thanks. And so another question here is from Matt Testa, and it's after doing the self-assessment and description exercises, what did you find was the biggest revelation?
As a partner, I could say on the project, after having done those, biggest revelation was how gappy our currently documented workflows were. And not to say that we had gaps in the work we did, although we also had that, but it was just that the workflows themselves were not documented in a way such that I could hand them to someone else and they could follow them, because I did them myself for, you know, the first 5 years of our work. And so I was constantly iterating which tool I was using and how I was using it and all those things. And so really, you know, one of the biggest revelations was, right, okay, how do you think about what steps are in this, and this, and this, and this, and what tools are we using actually, and how does that help us get to either resource allocation, get to, you know, working, you know, putting out to these open source communities like, hey, I've got an issue in these areas, and how many other people then were bringing like, I also have that issue. So I think that was some of the biggest revelations from my perspective as a partner on the project.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's really interesting. You know, when you're first starting out, it's so hard to keep up with your own documentation because you are making those iterative, you know, decisions all the time, and it's really hard to get to that point. So I'm glad that this could help build some documentation. We probably have time for one more question, and then I will close it out there. Does that sound good to everyone? Okay. So we have a specific one here, which is when looking at file names, is it best to keep original file names from the donor or rename according to institutional protocols? I think that's probably a great example of something that changes from institution to institution and probably would have been really tough to nail down in this kind of a project. Do others have any further reflections on that one? Go ahead, Corey. Yeah.
So again, speaking in my context, which is, you know, really making sure we have that sort of evidentiality of where did things come from and how can people reuse them, keeping the original file names as metadata and how that's linked to the renamed file names is critical from my perspective of thinking the archivist as institution archives. If someone refers in an email message to a file they sent someone, for instance, and I also have those files, it's going to be critical for me to be able to know what is that file, how is it renamed, if it was renamed by any of the processes. So being able to actually keep those original file names either through an inventory script or some of the other things that actually are produced automatically through a lot of these tools from my perspective, is an important thing to be able to do. The renaming often is sort of a thing that we would do in Access because people might want something renamed, or it's critical because of the way the tools need something for sequencing. But those original file names can be very important because they're referred to in a lot of other ways as well.
Well, that takes us almost right up to the top of the hour here. There was one more question that Hannah answered here where she shared the UC Born Digital description guidelines. That's another really great resource. So head over to the answered section to see that. And thank you everyone for coming and participating today. And I'll hand it over to Catherine if you want to close it out real quick.
Sure. I'll just say a huge thank you to all the project partners. Several of them were on the call today. And, you know, community-owned and community-supported infrastructures are so important. And they're such a big part of our workflows. Being able to do this kind of documentation and really see how different institutions are using them is one of the critical steps in making sure that the investments that we make in them go in the direction that really suits the field. So hopefully this project has laid some groundwork for that, and we'll look forward to seeing more and more workflows come out from lots of different types of institutions in the near future. Take care, everybody. Thank you for joining us today.